The men were standing still. That was the problem. 20,000 Roman soldiers, the finest heavy infantry in the known world, veterans of the Persian frontier, men who had spent years in iron chainmail under eastern suns, were standing motionless on an August plain in what is now Turkey. Throats cracked with thirst, lungs choked with smoke from fires their enemy had deliberately set, armor absorbing heat like a pan on a flame. They had been standing for hours, not because they were afraid, not because their commander had ordered them to rest. They were standing because their emperor had told them to wait, while a diplomatic negotiation played out. And a Gothic leader had sent a Christian priest with a private letter designed to buy time for a cavalry force that Roman scouts had completely, catastrophically failed to find. Emperor Valens commanded what Ammianus Marcellinus, a soldier historian who documented this day with the precision of a man who had survived war himself, records as somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 battle-hardened veterans. Roman scouts had reported the enemy at 10,000 warriors. Valens had been warned 3 times in the days before August 9th, 378, by personal letter, by messenger, by his own generals, to wait 3 more days for reinforcements that would make victory mathematically unassailable. He refused all 3 warnings. By sunset, 2/3 of that Roman army was dead. The emperor's body was burning in a farmhouse somewhere on that plain, or trampled beyond recognition into the ground, never found, never buried. And the myth that had held the empire together for 5 centuries had shattered in a single afternoon. But here's what historians have struggled to fully explain. Valens was not a reckless man. He was not impulsive by nature. Edward Gibbon, drawing on Ammianus, summarizes his character with a phrase that cuts to the heart of the mystery. An anxious regard to his personal safety was the ruling principle of his administration. A man constitutionally cautious, governing carefully for 14 years, with reinforcements days away and certain victory within reach, chose to attack alone. Something broke in Valens' judgment in those final hours that went beyond impatience, beyond military calculation, into territory the chronicles document but never fully illuminate. What drove a careful man to choose a battle he didn't need to fight is a question that sits at the center of everything that followed. You'll discover that the Gothic cavalry which destroyed the Roman army wasn't hiding or concealing itself. It was simply absent, miles away on a routine foraging operation when Roman scouts made their count. A failure Ammianus records without a single explanation for how trained military professionals missed an entire army. You'll discover that Fritigern, the Gothic leader who won this battle, spent the hours before the killing began sending a Christian priest to Valens with a private letter claiming personal desire for peace, but inability to control his own warriors. A piece of psychological manipulation so precisely calibrated that it held the Roman army standing in the August heat for hours reading it. And you'll discover that the treaty signed 4 years after this battle established a legal precedent that Rome had never set in 8 centuries of history, and that the direct descendants of the warriors who annihilated Valens' army used that precedent to sack Rome itself 32 years later. To understand why a careful emperor ignored every warning and chose a battle he didn't need to fight, we need to go back 2 years. To the moment a corrupt Roman bureaucrat sold Gothic children into slavery and accidentally guaranteed the destruction of the Eastern Roman field army. In 376 AD, the Roman Empire still looked like Rome. The eagle standard still flew on the Danube. The legions still drilled. The cities of the East, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, still pulsed with the commerce and architecture of a civilization that had been governing itself for 8 centuries. But what the architecture concealed What the eagle standards obscured was a structural reality that historians studying the late 4th century have come to recognize as the empire's defining characteristic. Rome had learned to look strong while running on increasingly fragile foundations. The military was the most visible symptom. Following the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine, the Roman army had been reorganized into 2 distinct components. The limitani were static border garrison troops, adequate for routine frontier security, but thin on quality. The comitatenses were the mobile field armies, well-paid, well-equipped, genuinely formidable. Modern estimates put the total Roman military establishment at perhaps 650,000 men by the late 4th century, twice the force Caesar had commanded. The number looked impressive. What it concealed was that the mobile forces capable of decisive action were a fraction of that total. They could not be everywhere simultaneously, and they were increasingly expensive to maintain. Emperor Valens, ruling the eastern half of the empire from Constantinople since 364, faced a particular version of this problem that his counterpart in the west did not. His eastern frontier abutted the Sassanid Persian Empire, a sophisticated, powerful adversary that had been bleeding Rome in Mesopotamia and Armenia for decades. By 376, Valens's best troops, his veteran field armies, were committed to the Persian frontier. The Danube, the empire's northern boundary, the line between Roman civilization and the vast Germanic world beyond, was held by the thinner forces of the limitanae and whatever mobile reserves he could scrape together. Into this structural tension walked something the imperial administration chose to view not as a crisis, but as an opportunity. The Goths, Germanic peoples who had been moving toward the Danube for months, displaced from their ancestral territories by the westward surge of Hunnic nomads, arrived at the river in autumn 376 in numbers that ancient sources describe as a vast mass of displaced humanity. Eunapius gives a figure of 200,000, including civilians. The modern historian Peter Heather, working from population estimates and army size calculations, suggests the Tervingi, the Western Gothic group, may have numbered approximately 50,000 people total, with perhaps 10,000 warriors. The Cambridge Ancient History places contemporary estimates at roughly 90,000 for the combined Gothic groups seeking entry. Whatever the precise number, the scale was extraordinary. Valens and his administration, examining the situation from Antioch, reached a conclusion that the Project Muse scholarly analysis of this period characterizes precisely. The Gothic petition caused more joy than fear. Here was a vast, untapped reservoir of military manpower. The imperial treasury had a mechanism called the aurum tyrannicum, a gold tax that Roman landowners could pay in lieu of providing military recruits. By accepting Gothic settlers and filling military ranks with their warriors, the treasury could collect the gold tax from Roman landowners while simultaneously bolstering army strength without the political cost of conscripting Roman citizens. The logic was sound. The execution was catastrophic. The responsibility for managing the crossing fell to 2 local Roman commanders: Lupicinus, the comes rei militaris for the Diocese of Thrace, and his subordinate Maximus. Ammianus Marcellinus, who held both men in undisguised contempt, characterizes them with a directness that leaves little ambiguity. They were, in his assessment, reckless and disastrous, men whose greed would transform a refugee resettlement into the fuse that destroyed the Eastern Roman field army. What Lupicinus and Maximus would do with the power they'd been handed, and what it would unleash, is the first catastrophic link in the chain that leads to August 9th, 378. Picture what the Gothic crossing actually looked like in the autumn of 376. Tens of thousands of people. Families with children, warriors, elderly men and women, all carrying whatever portable wealth they could bring from territories that the Huns had made uninhabitable. Crossing the Danube on whatever boats and rafts Roman authorities provided, landing on the southern bank in Roman Thrace with the understanding that they would receive the food, land, and the protection of the empire that had invited them in. This was the deal. This was what Valens had promised. What they found instead was Lupicinus. Ammianus Marcellinus describes what followed in Book 31 of his Res Gestae with the controlled fury of a man who understood both the human cost and the military consequences of what these two officials chose to do. Instead of distributing the imperial grain rations that Valens had promised, Lupicinus and Maximus engineered an artificial scarcity. They hoarded the food and established a black market. The Goths, who had crossed the river with gold, silver, jewelry, and the accumulated portable wealth of a displaced nation, found themselves paying extortionate prices for basic provisions. As their wealth depleted, the exchange rate shifted to something more disturbing. Ammianus records, as a single contemporary source, that the going rate for food eventually reached 1 Gothic child for 1 dog. The dog then consumed by the starving family. Whether this specific detail reflects Ammianus's tendency toward rhetorical heightening in atrocity accounts or accurately captures the scale of the exploitation, the broader pattern he documents is corroborated by the military consequences that followed immediately. While Lupicinus was conducting this operation, the rest of the Danube went unguarded. This was the second catastrophic failure, and it compounded everything. The Greutungi, the Eastern Gothic group under Elathius and Saphrax, who had been explicitly denied permission to enter, noticed that Roman border patrols had been diverted to the Tervingi crossing point. They built rafts. They crossed fully armed. 2 Gothic nations were now inside the empire simultaneously, and only one of them had agreed to disarm. Lupicinus eventually recognized that his extortion had pushed the armed Gothic population to the edge of open revolt. His solution was the kind of improvised brutality that characterizes men who have lost control of a situation they caused. He invited the primary Tervingi leaders, Fritigern and Alavivus, to a diplomatic banquet at his headquarters inside the walled city of Marcianople. The invitation was a trap. Only the chieftains and small bodyguard contingents were allowed through the city gates. The vast Gothic host was left in a camp outside. During the feast, a confrontation between Gothic guards and Roman soldiers outside the hall gave Lupicinus his pretext. He ordered the Gothic delegation killed. Alavivus was murdered at dinner. Fritigern was not. Ammianus records that Fritigern fought his way out of the banquet hall, through the Roman cordon, and back to his people outside the walls. The precise details of how one man escaped a coordinated assassination in a hostile city are not preserved in our sources. Ammianus focuses on the outcome rather than the method. What he documents is the consequence. Fritigern returned to the Gothic camp and raised the banner of open war. The Tervingi broke their encampment, armed themselves, and began moving. Lupicinus marched out with local troops to crush the uprising. He was annihilated. All his junior officers were killed. The military standards were captured, and the Gothic warriors who had crossed the Danube as refugees stripped the dead Roman soldiers of their arms, their armor, their shields, and their weapons. The army that would destroy the Eastern Roman field army at Adrianople 2 years later was being equipped at this precise moment. With Roman chainmail and Roman swords stripped from the Roman dead at Marcianople. The irony is almost too complete to be accidental. It was simply the logic of Lupicinus's greed working itself out to its military conclusion. Escaped slaves, many of them Goths who had been sold into Roman bondage in previous decades, some of them former soldiers who knew Roman military organization intimately, began finding their way to Fritigern's growing force. The countryside of Thrace began to burn, and Fritigern, who had arrived at the Danube as a refugee chieftain seeking the Empire's protection, was becoming something the Empire had never intended to create. A sophisticated military commander with genuine knowledge of Roman vulnerabilities, equipped with Roman weapons, and with absolutely nothing left to lose. Even his elevation to the purple lacks the drama the occasion demanded. Flavius Julius Valens was not born to imperial power. He was not a celebrated general or a political mastermind. He was a tribunus stabulorum, a tribune of stables, a mid-level military administrative officer. When his brother, Valentinian, newly acclaimed emperor in February 364, looked around for a co-ruler to manage the eastern half of a massive and unwieldy empire, and settled on family over merit. On March 28, 364, Valens became co-emperor not because of what he had achieved, but because of who he was related to. We should acknowledge, before proceeding, that our primary source for Valens' character is a man who had reasons to view him harshly. Ammianus Marcellinus was a pagan military officer who had served under Julian. The emperor Ammianus genuinely admired. And Valens was an Arian Christian who persecuted pagans and whose theological positions placed him at odds with both the Catholic majority in Constantinople and pagan intellectuals like Ammianus himself. Scholars have noted that Valens's Arianism made him deeply unpopular with Catholic historians, and that the calamitous nature of his loss at Adrianople may have been shaded darker in the historical record by those who had theological reasons to portray him as divinely punished. Ammianus, to his credit, is not purely hostile, but his portrait of Valens is not neutral either. What Ammianus documents with a specificity that transcends biographical bias is this: Valens was a competent administrator. For more than a decade, he managed the eastern provinces with genuine effectiveness. He suppressed the Procopius usurpation of 365 to 366, a serious challenge to his reign. With decisive military action, he managed the Persian frontier, held the Danube, kept the administrative machinery of the East functioning. Gibbon, drawing on Ammianus, summarizes the man in a phrase that rewards careful reading. An anxious regard to his personal safety was the ruling principle of his administration. This is not a description of a fool or a coward. It is a description of a careful man. Someone who calculated risk, who understood consequences, who preferred the certain over the spectacular. Against this portrait, the decision of August 9th, 378 becomes genuinely mysterious. The jealousy is documented. Ammianus is explicit about it, and multiple secondary sources working from his account confirm the pattern. Gratian, Valens's nephew, the Western Emperor, approximately 19 years old at the time of Adrianople, had recently won a spectacular victory against the Lentienses, an Alemannic tribe that had invaded Gaul at the Battle of Argentovaria near modern Colmar. Gratian was popular, young, militarily successful, and on his way with an army that would give the combined Roman force overwhelming superiority over the Gothic coalition. The people of Constantinople, who had been watching Gothic warriors plunder their countryside for 2 years, compared their emperor unfavorably to this brilliant young nephew. Ammianus records the public humiliation with the precision of a chronicler who understood its psychological weight. Valens, aging and deeply conscious of his unpopularity, had governed carefully for 14 years and had nothing that looked like a glorious military triumph to show for it. The man who might have been cautious his entire career, who might have waited 3 more days and shared the victory with Gratian, could not bear to share it. Ammianus preserves what he identifies as the actual motivation. Valens was eager to perform some glorious deed equal to his young nephew, consumed by envy at Gratian's military reputation. This is Ammianus's explicit causal analysis, not interpretive speculation. A careful man's one departure from caution was, as it happened, his last decision. There is one more detail that Ammianus records in the opening of Book 31 that is worth noting before we proceed, because it carries a dark and particular weight. In Antioch, before the campaign began, crowds had taken to shouting, "Let Valens be burned alive," during public disturbances. Roman officials at one point were directing citizens to gather firewood to set fire to the imperial baths that Valens had commissioned. Ammianus, writing with a sense that history had a shape to it, noted that this, almost in plain speech, showed that this kind of death threatened him. Whether or not that specific fate awaited Valens on August 9th, and we will return to that uncertainty. The careful man who had spent his reign in anxious self-protection was marching toward a plain where the careful calculations that had sustained him for 14 years were about to fail all at once. The phrase entered history at the walls of Adrianople in 376. When Fritigern's warriors spent a fruitless day hurling themselves against fortifications they lacked the engineering knowledge to breach. He gathered his frustrated commanders afterward and delivered a judgment that was, for a military leader, a remarkably honest assessment of his own limitations. He kept peace with walls. His people could not take fortified cities. They should stop trying. The open country was theirs. The walls belonged to Rome. What makes this phrase worth noting at the outset is what it reveals about the man who said it. Fritigern was a Thervingi Gothic chieftain who had already had more exposure to Roman power and Roman thinking than almost any Gothic leader of his generation. He had previously appealed to Emperor Valens for military assistance in a civil conflict within Gothic society, a bid for Roman support against the rival king Athanaric. He had, according to the World History Encyclopedia's account drawing on ancient sources, converted to Arian Christianity, deliberately aligning himself with Valens' own theological position in a gesture of diplomatic intelligence that paid immediate dividends in access and credibility. He understood Romans. And after Marcianople, after the banquet where Alavivis was murdered and he fought his way free, he understood what kind of war he was now fighting and what kind of war he could win. The 2 years between Marcianople and Adrianople were Fritigern's education in Roman military vulnerability. He could not take cities, but he could do something almost as strategically valuable. He could make the open countryside of Thrace into a zone where Roman authority did not exist. His warriors dispersed into mobile raiding bands, striking Roman villas, destroying agricultural infrastructure, plundering the accumulated wealth of one of the empire's richest agricultural provinces. Roman slaves, many of them Goths, sold into bondage in previous decades, escaped their masters and brought with them detailed knowledge of Roman logistics, supply routes, and the location of hidden stores of food and weapons. By 377, Fritigern had even hired mercenary bands of Huns and Alans, paying them with plunder, a remarkable reversal of the situation that had driven his people to the Danube in the first place. The Battle of Ad-Salices, known to history as the Battle of the Willows, fought in the summer of 377, demonstrated both Fritigern's strengths and his limitations. A combined Roman force under the Frankish general Richomeres met Fritigern's army in a day-long infantry engagement that Warfare History Network describes as a horrific, grinding stalemate from dawn until dusk. Neither side achieved tactical breakthrough, but the strategic outcome favored the Goths decisively. The Romans suffered sufficient casualties that they abandoned their strategy of geographic containment, and the Goths kept the field, kept their mobility, and kept stripping territory of everything Rome needed to supply and reinforce the frontier. Then came Sebastianus, and a problem. The Roman general appointed to reorganize the armies in Thrace brought with him a strategy that threatened to work. Small, mobile strike teams operating at night, ambushing isolated Gothic foraging parties, slowly destroying Fritigern's logistical foundation. Ammianus records that the loot Sebastianus brought back to Adrianople was too much for the city to hold. It was working. Fritigern responded by consolidating his scattered forces, but he now faced a strategic trap. He was too weak to assault Valens' fortified camp outside Adrianople. But the guerrilla war was becoming unsustainable. What he needed was for Valens to come to him. On ground, Fritigern chose. At a moment, Fritigern controlled. And a jealous emperor, watching his nephew's victories from a distance, was about to provide exactly that opportunity. On the 6th of August, 378, Roman cavalry scouts returned to Valens' fortified camp outside Adrianople and delivered a report that would determine the fate of the Eastern Roman field army. They had located the Gothic host, encamped on elevated ground approximately 25 kilometers north of the city, circled in their characteristic wagon fortress. The warrior count, approximately 10,000 men. Ammianus Marcellinus records this figure without comment, but then records what followed in a way that makes his own skepticism clear. He notes that the Roman scouts had underestimated the Gothic strength, though he does not explain how trained military professionals committed so fundamental a surveillance error. The consensus explanation among modern historians is that the Greuthungi cavalry under Alathius and Saphrax was literally elsewhere, away from the camp on a foraging operation, miles into the countryside, when the Roman scouts conducted their count. Ammianus doesn't state this explicitly. It is the scholarly inference that best accounts for both the undercount and the subsequent arrival. But the core fact is undisputed. Roman military intelligence, on the eve of the most catastrophic engagement in a generation, had missed an entire army. Valens called a council of war. What followed has been preserved in two accounts that directly contradict each other, a source conflict that historians have never fully resolved. Ammianus, writing in Latin in Rome in the 390s, portrays the senior general victor as counseling patience and waiting for Gratian's reinforcements. The pagan philosopher-historian Eunapius, whose account survives only in fragments but provides an alternative contemporary perspective, reverses this. In his version, Sebastianus was the advocate for caution. Both accounts agree that Valens made the final decision. Both agree the decision was to attack immediately. On the specific advice given around the table, our two primary sources simply disagree, and no third source resolves the conflict. What the historical record preserves is the outcome of the debate, not its precise content. What Valens knew before that decision was made is not in doubt. Ricomers, the Frankish general serving as Gratian's personal envoy, had returned from the Western Emperor carrying an explicit letter. Gratian was at the Suksi Pass, the strategic gateway through the mountains that separated the Balkans from the Danube frontier. He was days away, close enough that his message was urgent rather than advisory. Wait for me. The combined force would be overwhelming. Valens' own officers, including Victor, made the same argument. Every piece of information available pointed in the same direction. Fritigern, watching the Roman camp from the Gothic position, understood his own problem precisely. His infantry could not attack the fortified Roman encampment. His cavalry, the Groithungi force under Elathius and Saphrax, was abroad and would take time to recall. He needed delay. On the 8th of August, he sent an envoy proposing peace and an alliance in exchange for Roman territory. Valens, encouraged by faulty intelligence suggesting he held numerical superiority, dismissed the offer. The next morning, the 9th of August, Fritigern sent the Christian priest. The priest carried two communications. One was a formal diplomatic proposal. The Goths wished to settle in Thrace. The second was a private letter addressed to Valens personally. In it, Fritigern explained that he personally desired peace, but that his warriors were volatile, difficult to control, and could not be held back without some show of Roman military strength to intimidate them into accepting terms. What Valens should do, Fritigern suggested, was deploy his army in full battle formation as a demonstration of force. The letter was requesting exactly what Valens would have done anyway, while negotiations continued. It was also, whether by premeditated design or opportunistic adaptation, and Ammianus's account makes the delay effect clear without specifying the precise intent. Perfectly positioned to burn hours of August daylight, while the Gothic cavalry rode back from wherever foraging had taken it. Valens left his treasury in Adrianople that morning, left his administration, left his heavy baggage. He was not planning to return before nightfall, with anything but a victory. He marched his army 8 miles north toward the Gothic camp on the hill. The city of Adrianople has been fought over more times than perhaps any other place on earth. The historian John Keegan, in his study of the history of warfare, noted that at least 15 to 16 major battles or sieges are known to have taken place within its vicinity, between a Roman Civil War clash in 323 AD and the Balkan Wars of 1913, a span of 1,600 years of continuous military contest. Keegan explained the pattern with characteristic precision. It was not the city's wealth or population that made it a perpetual epicenter of violence, but its geography. Adrianople sits on the main invasion route from the Balkans toward the Bosphorus and Constantinople. Whoever controls Adrianople controls movement between southern Europe and Asia Minor. The plains around it have drunk blood across 16 centuries because geography, unlike politics, doesn't change. The plain that Valens' army approached on the morning of August 9th was everything the Gothic position required. The battlefield's precise location remains uncertain. Modern scholarship has identified 3 candidate sites, all north of the city, and no archaeological excavation has definitively confirmed any of them. What the ancient sources agree on is the essential topography. A low hill rising from the surrounding terrain, with the Gothic wagon circle positioned at its summit. The elevation gave Gothic archers and infantry a range and height advantage. It made the Roman approach uphill. It gave the Carrigo, the wagon fortress, the character of a hilltop fortification rather than a field camp. Before Valens' army arrived, Fritigern ordered the surrounding fields set alight. August in what is now European Turkey is brutally dry, and the scrub and dry grass caught and burned freely. Ammianus Marcellinus records the fires explicitly. Their purpose was threefold. Smoke reduced Roman visibility and situational awareness. The additional heat around men already wearing iron chainmail and scale armor in the August sun accelerated dehydration and exhaustion. And the psychological effect of marching toward fire through smoke added another layer of stress to soldiers who had already been on their feet since early morning. The Romans arrived around the 8th hour, approximately 2 in the afternoon. They had marched 8 miles without food or water, in full armor, through smoke, under a sun that Ammianus's account suggests was at its most punishing. Warfare History Network, drawing on ancient sources, describes their condition on arrival as one of severe physical degradation. The greatest heavy infantry force in the known world reached the Gothic position already compromised. Not by their enemy's strength, but by their own emperor's decision to march 8 miles and fight on the same day. The deployment that followed was incomplete. This detail in Ammianus's account is among the most tactically significant in his entire battle narrative. Roman doctrine required a deliberate, organized deployment from march column into battle line. A complex maneuver that took time and demanded discipline. Ammianus records explicitly that when the battle began, the Roman rear column was still arriving at the field. The army that Valens intended to deploy in 3 organized lines, infantry center, cavalry wings, was still sorting itself into position when everything came apart. The Gothic wagon circle sat on the hill above them. The fires burned. The priest's letter was still being processed through Roman diplomatic channels. And the Roman soldiers who had been promised a battle against 10,000 warriors were discovering that the plain around them felt larger, emptier, and more uncertain than their intelligence had suggested it would be. The Battle of Adrianople began not with an imperial decree, not with a trumpet signal, not with the deliberate order of a Roman commander calculating the moment. It began with a mistake. Bacurius the Iberian was the officer responsible. Ammianus Marcellinus names him specifically, a detail that suggests historical accuracy rather than literary convenience, since there was no reason to invent a name for an episode that was ultimately embarrassing. Bacurius was an Iberian prince, a man from what is now the country of Georgia, serving in the Roman military in command of the Scole shield archers, one of the most prestigious cavalry units in the entire Roman order of battle, the Imperial Guard's mounted arm. He was, in other words, not a junior officer acting impulsively in a moment of confusion. He was a senior commander of elite troops who attacked the Gothic position while the diplomatic exchange was still officially in progress. Rich Omers, Gratian's personal envoy, had been walking across the open ground between the 2 armies, alone, unarmed, serving as the Roman hostage to guarantee good faith during the negotiations. He was still in motion toward the Gothic lines when Bacurius led his shield archers forward at the gallop. A second cavalry unit, unnamed by Ammianus, followed almost immediately. Both charges drove toward the Gothic wagon circle on the hill. Both were repelled. The Gothic infantry defending from behind the wagon barrier used what Ammianus's account implies was a coordinated defensive response. Arrows, javelins, hurled stones from the elevated position, concentrated on the Roman cavalry as it came uphill. The momentum of both charges was broken. The diplomats scattered, and Emperor Valens, watching from the Roman center as his carefully managed situation disintegrated, faced the reality that he no longer had the option of controlled decision-making. The battle had begun, whether he'd ordered it or not. He ordered a general advance. Ammianus records this decision with a phrase that carries enormous historical weight. Valens commanded the full attack, even though his infantry was not fully prepared. The rear column was still marching up to the field. Formations that should have been organized, positioned, and psychologically ready for battle were still completing their deployment from march order when the trumpets called the assault. What followed defied the physical logic of the situation. The Roman heavy infantry, exhausted, thirsty, fighting uphill through smoke against defenders behind a wagon barrier, performed with the discipline of professionals who had spent their careers training for exactly this kind of engagement. They pushed the Gothic infantry back. The left wing of the Roman line, driving with particular force, reached the outer perimeter of the wagon circle itself. Ammianus records that it would have penetrated further if it had received support. Roman doctrine was working. Roman bodies, despite everything Valens had done to compromise them, were executing with the accumulated precision of an empire's military tradition. For perhaps half an hour, Ammianus's account doesn't provide exact timing for this phase. It looked as though the impossible march, the inadequate intelligence, the incomplete deployment, and the emperor's catastrophic impatience might not matter. The Roman left was at the wagons. The Roman cavalry on the right flank, designated to protect the infantry's exposed side, had not yet closed to its supporting position. The rear of the army was still coming up, and somewhere on the horizon behind the Roman position, in a direction no scout was currently watching, a cloud of dust was growing rapidly larger. Quote 2. That is Ammianus Marcellinus's language. Not a cavalry advance, not an attack from the flank, a thunderbolt. Ammianus was a military professional, a man who had served in actual campaigns against actual armies. He knew the difference between a competent cavalry assault and something that registered as meteorological. The choice of the word tells us something about how the arrival of Alathius and Saphrax's Greuthungi cavalry felt to the people who experienced it. The Greuthungi had been foraging, the consensus scholarly explanation for why Roman scouts had failed to find them in their earlier count. The modern historical interpretation, as recorded in the Wikipedia article on the Battle of Adrianople, drawing on the relevant scholarship, is that Alathius and Saphrax's forces were away from the Gothic camp, engaged in the routine logistical operation of gathering food and supplies from the surrounding countryside. When Roman cavalry made their estimate of 10,000 Gothic warriors. This explains the undercount without requiring any spectacular Roman surveillance failure. The cavalry was simply not there to be counted. Ammianus records the undercount as fact and offers no mechanism. The foraging explanation is the scholarly inference that best fits the available evidence. What is not inferential is the timing. The Greuthungi cavalry returned to the battlefield at the precise moment when the Roman left wing was fully committed to its assault on the Gothic wagon circle. The Roman right wing had not yet closed to its supporting position, and the Roman rear was still arriving. The army that Valens had marched 8 miles to commit to battle was maximally extended, maximally exposed, and maximally unable to respond when Alathius and Saphrax's horsemen arrived and immediately attacked without pausing to organize. They struck the Roman left flank. The Roman left-wing cavalry, the units designated to protect the infantry's most exposed side, was in precisely the wrong position at precisely the wrong moment. Ammianus records the outcome in a sentence that World History Encyclopedia preserves in translation. The left wing, which had made its way as far as the very wagons and would have gone farther if it had received support, being deserted by the rest of the cavalry and hard-pressed by the enemy's numbers, was crushed and overwhelmed as if by the downfall of a mighty rampart. It did not retreat in good order. It did not execute a fighting withdrawal. It fled the battlefield entirely, leaving the Roman infantry, which had been pushing forward so effectively moments before, completely naked on its most vulnerable side. The Alan cavalry that accompanied the Greuthungi added another dimension to the assault. Ammianus notes their presence in the Greuthungi force, steppe horsemen of Iranian origin, whose riding and archery techniques were distinct from Gothic standards, giving the flanking assault a combined arms quality that Roman doctrine had not planned for. Here is where the long historiographical argument begins, and the script must be honest about it. Charles Oman, writing in 1885, interpreted this moment as the decisive proof that Gothic cavalry had shattered Roman infantry supremacy, heralding 1,000 years of mounted warrior dominance and the eventual emergence of the medieval knight. The __quote_3_ phrase became, in Omen's influential telling, the sound of a new era beginning. Ties. Burns, in a 1973 scholarly reassessment, challenged this reading directly. The Gothic army was primarily infantry, not cavalry. Valens may have had comparable or greater cavalry numbers, and the battle was decided not by Gothic mounted superiority, but by Roman tactical failure, exhaustion, and the specific bad timing of the Groithungi's return. Modern military historians largely follow Burns. The Roman infantry was not made obsolete on August 9th. It was betrayed by intelligence failure, by physical compromise, and by an emperor's impatience, and then abandoned by the cavalry that was supposed to protect it. With the left wing gone, the arithmetic of ancient warfare became very simple and very brutal. What Ammianus Marcellinus recorded of those hours is written in the language of a soldier who had been in battle himself and who understood what the words meant. Men packed so tightly that the dead could not fall, held upright by the pressure of the living bodies around them. Swords that could not be drawn because there was no room to raise an arm. The heat, which had been punishing since morning, becoming something else entirely inside a mass of bodies generating their own thermal energy under August sky. And underneath all of it, always, the thirst. Because these men had had nothing to drink since the camp at Adrianople, which was 8 miles away, which might as well have been 800. The encirclement was the work of minutes once the left-wing cavalry fled. With the Roman flank unprotected, the Groithungi horsemen wheeled inward, the natural cavalry response to an exposed infantry formation. Simultaneously, the Gothic infantry inside the wagon circle, which had been fighting defensively since the battle began, surged forward in a counterattack. The Romans, who had been pressing toward the wagons moments before, now found themselves attacked from the front by a reinvigorated Gothic line and from the flank and rear by cavalry. The formations that had been Roman doctrine's greatest strength, tightly packed, disciplined, mutually supporting, became their deadliest vulnerability. The tighter the pocket, the less room to fight. The less room to fight, the higher the density. The higher the density, the more men died for each Gothic sword stroke. There are specific elite units that Ammianus names in the account of this final phase, and their presence tells us something about how complete the Roman collapse was. The Lanciari and the Mattiari, veteran Palatine infantry formations listed in the Notitia Dignitatum as the highest tier of Roman regular forces. Men who represented the accumulated fighting experience of years on the Persian frontier, gathered around Emperor Valens as the rest of the army disintegrated. They formed a defensive perimeter. They held it for a time. Then they were overwhelmed too. Ancient sources suggest the fighting lasted roughly 5 hours in total, from the unauthorized cavalry charge in mid-afternoon until the eerie quiet that Warfare History Network's account describes settling over the plain at dusk. 5 hours of sustained close combat in the August heat by men who had been marching since dawn without food or water. The physical reality of what that meant for the survivors is preserved in Ammianus's description of the aftermath. The wounded lying across the dead, calling for water in the darkness, suffocating slowly under the weight of the bodies piled on top of them as the temperature finally dropped with the end of the day. The accounting of what Rome lost in those 5 hours goes beyond casualty figures. Ammianus records 35 tribunes killed. The regimental commanders and senior staff officers who represented the institutional knowledge of how to organize, supply, and direct an army in the field. The emperor was dead, his body unrecovered. The generals Sebastianus and Trajan were killed. The master of the offices, the senior administrative official responsible for coordinating imperial communications, was dead. The quartermaster general, the man who knew where Rome's military supplies were, how to move them, and how to maintain field operations across the eastern frontier, was dead. Rome didn't just lose a battle that afternoon. It lost the institutional memory of how to fight one. The standard measure of ancient catastrophe compares numerical loss to established precedents. 2/3 of the Roman army destroyed, Ammianus assesses, and then reaches for the only comparison he considers adequate. The annals, he writes, record no such massacre of a battle except the one at Cannae. Cannae, where Hannibal killed 50,000 Romans in a single afternoon in 216 BC. The comparison was not rhetorical. It was Ammianus's professional military judgment that August 9th, 378, was the second worst day in the history of Roman arms. He was right. The Eastern Roman emperor died on August 9th, 378. On that much, history is certain. Everything else, where precisely, how, in whose company, whether he knew what he was, is one of the most genuinely unresolved questions in late antique history, preserved in two accounts that Ammianus Marcellinus himself records without choosing between them. The first account is the more probable. Ammianus writes with the measured language of a man reporting what most participants believed. At the first coming of darkness, the emperor, amid the common soldiers as was supposed, fell mortally wounded by an arrow, and presently breathed his last breath. And he was never afterwards found anywhere. In this version, Valens died anonymously in the killing pocket, his body indistinguishable from the thousands of ordinary Roman soldiers who died around him. His imperial regalia stripped by scavengers, his face unrecognized in the chaos and darkness. The most powerful man in the Eastern Roman world became one corpse among 15,000. His body was trampled into the ground, never identified, never claimed, never buried. The first Roman emperor killed in battle against foreign enemies since Decius fell at the Battle of Adrianople in 251, 127 years earlier, was given no ceremony, no tomb, no confirmed final resting place. He lies somewhere in the fields north of modern Edirne, Turkey. We will never find him. The second account spread through the Roman world in the months after the battle, and was circulated widely enough that Ammianus felt obligated to record it. In this version, Valens was wounded by an arrow, but not immediately killed. A small contingent of bodyguards and palace eunuchs extracted him from the main collapse and carried him to a nearby peasant cottage. A two-story structure with a fortified upper floor that could be defended against infantry attack. The Goths who followed didn't know who was inside. They attempted to plunder the cottage in the routine way of a victorious army moving through the aftermath of a battlefield. The bodyguards fired arrows down from the upper floor and drove them back. Frustrated by the unexpected resistance, the Gothic warriors piled dry wood and brush against the doors and set the cottage alight. As the building burned, one of the bodyguards jumped from an upper window and told the Goths who was inside. They had burned an emperor alive. His body was never recovered from the ruins. Most modern historians consider the first account more plausible. Extracting a wounded emperor from a complete battlefield encirclement would have been extraordinarily difficult, and no captured bodyguard would logically have revealed his charge's identity. The second account reads, in the scholarly assessment, like the kind of dramatically shaped story that circulates after catastrophic events, a narrative that gives a chaotic death the form of a final scene. But Ammianus himself, recording both accounts, notes something that he clearly found significant enough to include. Before the campaign, in the city of Antioch, crowds during public disturbances had been shouting, "Let Valens be burned alive." Roman officials had at points been directing people to gather firewood to set fire to the imperial baths Valens had commissioned. Ammianus writes that this, almost in plain speech, showed that this kind of death threatened him. Whether the burning story is true or not, Ammianus preserved the irony because he thought it belonged in the historical record. The man whose subjects had wished him burned died, in the most widely circulated account of his death, in a fire. History preserved his decision. It could not preserve his body. The careful emperor who had spent 14 years governing with anxious regard for his personal safety died without personal certainty. Not in victory, not in defeat, but in a darkness that has never fully lifted. Dawn on the 10th of August revealed a plain that the ancient sources, working through shock to description, could only measure against the most extreme precedent in Roman memory. Ammianus Marcellinus wrote that the annals recorded no such massacre except Cannae, where Hannibal had killed 50,000 Romans in a single afternoon in 216 BC, where the senators in Rome had removed their rings and poured them in a heap on the floor of the Carthaginian treasury. That was the scale of comparison Ammianus reached for, and he was a professional soldier who had seen war. He was not exaggerating for effect. He was placing August 9th in the only historical context large enough to contain it. The numbers, assembled from Ammianus's account and the modern scholarly consensus that works backward from them, are these. 2/3 of the Roman army committed to battle was dead. Working from the modern estimate of 15,000 to 20,000 Roman troops at Adrianople, itself derived from Warren Treadgold's analysis of late Roman army strength and adjusted downward for the units held back to protect Adrianople and other threatened positions. That fraction translates to somewhere between 10,000 and 13,000 Roman soldiers lying on the plain north of the city. 35 tribunes killed, 2 senior generals dead, the master of the offices and the quartermaster general gone, the emperor's body unrecovered. The institutional structure of the Eastern Roman military's field command had been, in a single afternoon, functionally decapitated. The Gothic reaction to their own victory illustrates, with some historical irony, the limits of what they had achieved. Fritigern moved his forces to Adrianople the day after the battle, the city where Valens had left his treasury, his administration, his imperial standards, the infrastructure of Eastern Roman governance. The Goths could not take it. The walls that had been irrelevant to the battle were entirely relevant to the siege, and the Goths lacked siege weapons, siege engineering knowledge, and the logistical capacity to sustain a prolonged investment of a fortified city. Fritigern, true to the principle he had articulated years earlier, counseled his people to leave it alone. His warriors, flush with the greatest military victory their generation had ever seen, refused to listen. They spent a day in fruitless assaults on the walls and achieved nothing. The city held. The treasury and the imperial administration survived. Everything that the battle had failed to destroy, the walls protected. From Adrianople, the Gothic coalition moved toward Constantinople itself, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, the city Valens had left months earlier. They reached its outskirts. They could not breach its walls either. The empire that had lost its field army still had its fortifications, and fortifications, as Fritigern had understood since 376, were something his people had never learned to overcome. The wider Roman world's reaction to the news from Adrianople was documented by contemporaries as something approaching civilizational terror. St. Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, and one of the most influential Christian thinkers of the 4th century, wrote in language that reflected the collective psychological shock of a civilization that had believed, on some level, in its own invincibility. The battle, he wrote, marked the end of humanity and the end of the world. Not the end of a dynasty, not the end of a campaign, not the end of a reign. The end of the world. The myth of Roman military supremacy, which had been the ideological foundation of the empire's authority over 100 subject peoples for 5 centuries, had shattered in 5 hours on a plain in Thrace. Meanwhile, the Magister Militum Julius, the senior Eastern military commander now functioning without an emperor, made a decision that documented the panic of the immediate aftermath more precisely than any rhetorical response could. He feared the Gothic soldiers already serving inside the empire, integrated into Roman military units across the eastern territories, would learn of Adrianople and defect to Fritigern. He had them lured together in small groups and massacred. Word spread. Gothic civilian populations in Asia Minor rioted. The Romans suppressed the riots and killed again, the innocent alongside the guilty by Ammianus's own account. The empire responded to its worst military disaster in over a century by generating fresh atrocities that had nothing to do with military logic and everything to do with institutional fear. With Valens dead and the Eastern Field Army destroyed, the Roman Empire needed a new Eastern emperor with enough administrative competence to rebuild a military from scratch and enough strategic clarity to understand that the military he was rebuilding was not, for years to come, capable of defeating the Gothic coalition in open battle. Gratian, who was managing the Western Empire, while also dealing with the aftermath of his uncle's catastrophic decision, made the appointment in January 379. The man he chose was Theodosius, later called Theodosius the Great, later the last emperor to rule a unified Roman Empire. And the choice was made not because Theodosius was a great general, but because he was available, capable, and from a prominent military family. The task Theodosius inherited was stark. The Gothic coalition controlled the Balkans. The Thracian countryside had been plundered for 3 years. The veteran formations that had been Rome's eastern military strength were dead on a plain north of Adrianople. What he had to work with were the garrison troops that had survived by staying in cities the Goths couldn't breach, the remaining Western Roman forces that Gratian could spare, and whatever new recruits the conscription system, running, according to the evidence of the period, against intense popular resistance, could produce. Theodosius issued edicts against self-mutilation to avoid military service. The existence of these laws tells its own story about popular enthusiasm for serving in the Roman army after Adrianople. Men were apparently removing fingers, hands, or other extremities to make themselves ineligible for the draft. Theodosius made this illegal. People kept doing it anyway, at sufficient scale to require repeated legal reinforcement. The army he was building was being built against the active resistance of the population it was meant to protect. His strategy, under these constraints, was the only viable one. Attrition rather than pitched battle. Small mobile units, harassment, the slow erosion of Gothic logistical capacity. When larger engagements were attempted before his forces were ready, they were, by contemporary accounts, badly handled. When he deployed his rebuilt army in full field operations, he was working with recruits whose limitations he knew and respected enough not to risk in decisive engagement against an enemy that had just destroyed Rome's finest veterans. The parallel war of atrocities continued. Gothic populations throughout the empire were killed in the panic response that followed Julius's initial massacre. The eastern provincial populations, already traumatized by years of Gothic raiding, were now living in an empire that had simultaneously lost its military credibility and its ability to protect them. The 4 years between Adrianople and the peace settlement of 382 were not years of Roman recovery so much as years of mutual exhaustion. A grinding, unresolved standoff in which neither side could achieve what it actually wanted. There is one consequence of Adrianople's immediate aftermath that belongs in this segment because it operated on a different register entirely from the military and political damage. Valens had been an Arian Christian, a theological position that held the Son of God to be a created being subordinate to the Father, in contrast to the Nicene position that would eventually define Catholic and Orthodox Christianity. His death removed the empire's most powerful Arian patron. In 380, Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica, making Nicene Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. The theological history of Western civilization, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, and every tradition that descended from the Nicene formulation, runs through a chain of consequences that includes an arrow on August 9th, 378. The Gothic cavalry that arrived from the countryside did not intend to settle a theological controversy. History doesn't ask about intentions. 8 centuries of Roman history had established one foundational principle about barbarian peoples who settled inside imperial borders. They became Romans. They adopted Roman law, Roman customs, Roman administrative structures, Roman political loyalty. The process was imperfect, uneven, and often coercive. But the endpoint was assimilation, absorption, the dissolution of separate identity into the larger Roman whole. It had worked, more or less, for 800 years. The treaty signed on the 3rd of October, 382, 4 years after Adrianople, brokered by the generals Recomer and Saturninus negotiating for Rome, abandoned that principle entirely. For the first time in the history of the Roman state, the Visigoths received land in Thrace. This alone was not unprecedented. Gothic settlers had been placed in Roman territory before under federati arrangements. What was unprecedented was everything else. They retained their own kings, governing with internal autonomy. They kept their own laws. They kept their weapons. They owed military service to Rome when called upon. They owed nothing else. No tax, no Roman legal jurisdiction over internal affairs, no pressure toward assimilation. A sovereign, armed nation inside the Roman Empire's borders, governed by its own leadership, bound only by the obligation to fight when Rome asked. The Project Muse. Scholarly analysis of this period frames Theodosius's decision with appropriate precision. He recognized the futility of military confrontation against the invaders and accepted the only terms the Goths would take. This was not magnanimity or foresight. It was the acknowledgement of a military reality. Rome's rebuilt army could not yet defeat the Gothic coalition. The Goths wanted permanent settlement more than continued war. The treaty gave each side what it most urgently needed. It did not give Rome what it had always required, the eventual absorption of the settlers into the imperial population. The mechanism by which this precedent became catastrophic requires one name and approximately 30 years. Alaric was a Visigothic nobleman born approximately 370 AD, a child of the generation that grew up inside the Roman Empire under the 382 treaties framework in the Visigothic community settled in Thrace. He served in the Roman military. Gothic foederati under Roman command was the treaty's central provision, and Alaric's early career followed that path. When Roman emperors repeatedly failed to pay the financial obligations to Gothic foederati that the treaty required, when Gothic soldiers were deployed in the most dangerous situations and their losses were disregarded, when the political promises made to Alaric personally were broken multiple times by multiple administrations. Alaric had a legal framework and an armed community to draw on. On August 24th, 410 AD, 32 years after Adrianople, 623 years after the traditional founding of the city, Alaric's Visigoths entered Rome. The Eternal City was sacked for the first time in 8 centuries. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, described the news as reaching him like a thunderbolt. The city that had conquered the world had itself been conquered. The Goths who walked through Rome's gates were the grandchildren of the warriors who had stood at the Gothic wagon circle on the hill north of Adrianople and watched the thunderstorm of cavalry that arrived from the countryside. The empire that solved an immediate crisis with a treaty it couldn't afford to reject had built the future on a foundation that would not hold. Theodosius was pragmatic and exhausted and, in 382, entirely correct about the military situation. The treaty was the only viable option. It was also, across the span of 3 decades and 1 generation, the mechanism of Rome's most symbolic defeat. For more than a century after its publication, a single interpretive claim shaped how educated people understood what had happened at Adrianople. Charles Oman, writing in 1885 in his influential study of medieval warfare, proposed a reading of August 9th that was clean, dramatic, and, as subsequent scholarship has demonstrated, substantially wrong. Gothic heavy cavalry, in Oman's telling, had decisively defeated Roman heavy infantry. The Thunderbolt of Alathius and Saphrax had not merely won a battle. It had proven that the age of the foot soldier was over, and the age of the mounted warrior, leading, eventually, to the medieval knight, had begun. Adrianople was, in this interpretation, the hinge point between the ancient world and the medieval one, the afternoon when the future of European warfare was decided by horsemen arriving from the Thracian countryside. The problem, as the military historian T.S. Burns argued in a 1973 reassessment, is that this reading requires the evidence to do something it cannot actually do. The Gothic army at Adrianople was primarily infantry, not cavalry. Fritigern's force, the Tervingi who had crossed the Danube in 376 and fought through 2 years of guerrilla war, was a predominantly foot soldier force that had been equipped, in considerable part, with looted Roman arms and armor. The Greuthungi cavalry under Alathius and Saphrax, which delivered the decisive flanking blow, was a second army attached to Fritigern's coalition, not representative of some general Gothic cavalry supremacy. Burns further argued that Valens' Roman army may have actually possessed comparable or greater cavalry numbers than the Gothic force. The battle, in Burns' analysis, was decided not by Gothic mounted superiority, but by Roman tactical failure. The intelligence error that left the army unprepared for a force it hadn't counted, the exhaustion that had degraded the troops before they reached the field, the incomplete deployment that left the flank exposed, and the absence of the left-wing cavalry at the moment the Greuthungi arrived. Modern military historians largely follow Burns rather than Oman. The Wikipedia article on the Battle of Adrianople, synthesizing the current scholarly consensus, notes explicitly that more recent scholarly works mostly agree that the armies were similarly sized, that Gothic infantry was more decisive than their cavalry, and that neither the Romans nor the Goths used stirrups until the 6th century. The stirrups having been introduced to European warfare by the Avars approximately 200 years after Adrianople. Any account of this battle that credits Gothic cavalry with using stirrups is describing a different battle from the one that happened. What the Oman-Burns debate reveals, beyond the specific tactical question, is something worth noting about how military history forms its interpretations. The Oman reading is more dramatic. A thunderbolt of cavalry ushering in a new era is a better story than exhausted infantrymen abandoned by their own cavalry support because their emperor was too jealous to wait 3 days for his nephew. The more accurate explanation points not to Gothic military genius, but to a cascade of Roman failures. Institutional, psychological, and logistical that compounded until they became catastrophic. Military institutions that study this battle for pedagogical purposes study it precisely because of this. The most dramatic explanation of a military disaster is often not the most accurate one. And the most accurate one is usually more uncomfortable than the dramatic version because it locates the cause not in the enemy's strength, but in the loser's own decisions. Burns's argument implies something that deserves to be stated plainly. Adrianople was not inevitable. The Romans could have won, or avoided the battle entirely. 3 days separated Valens from the reinforcements that would have made the engagement unnecessary. A functioning intelligence apparatus would have found the Greutungi cavalry. A left wing that held its position would have prevented the encirclement. A commander not consumed by envy might have made different calculations at the Council of War. Every variable that made Adrianople catastrophic was a Roman variable. Battles are remembered through their commanders. Commanders are remembered if they survive long enough for history to keep building their story. By those measures, Adrianople is a battle that history systematically forgot. Not because it wasn't important, but because almost everyone who shaped it either died on the day or disappeared from the record before the consequences fully unfolded. Valens: no body, no tomb, no confirmed death. The first Roman emperor killed in battle against foreign enemies in 127 years lies in unmarked ground somewhere north of modern Edirne, Turkey. He was almost 50 years old. He had reigned for 14 years. He left no monument other than the disaster he created, and even the disaster has been, for most of history, insufficiently appreciated. Fritigern. The World History Encyclopedia records that he died around 380 AD, approximately 2 years after Adrianople. The precise circumstances are unknown. He does not appear in any source after the battle. The man who defeated the Roman Empire at its worst military moment since Cannae. The commander who turned a refugee camp into a field army that destroyed the Eastern Roman military establishment has no confirmed death, no burial site, no final recorded words, no historical moment that marks his passing. He vanishes from the sources before the peace treaty that ratified everything he had fought for was signed. Alathius and Saphrax, the Greutungi commanders whose cavalry Ammianus described as a thunderbolt, the men most directly responsible for the tactical mechanics of the Roman encirclement, also disappear from the historical record before the 382 treaty. The Gothic War Wikipedia article notes their absence explicitly. By the time peace was declared, Fritigern, Alathius, and Saphrax are never again mentioned in the ancient histories, and their ultimate fates are unknown. The 3 commanders who destroyed the Eastern Roman field army all died, apparently, without history bothering to record how or when. Gratian, 3 days away on the morning of August 9th, lived for 5 more years. He appointed Theodosius, managed the Western Empire, and was murdered in 383 by the forces of the usurper Magnus Maximus, a general from Britain who raised a revolt in Gaul and had Gratian killed before Theodosius could intervene. The nephew who might have prevented the worst Roman military disaster in a century was himself killed by a Roman 5 years later. Theodosius survived them all, managed the aftermath, signed the 382 treaty, and eventually became the last emperor to rule a unified Roman Empire before his death in 395. The Gothic foederati settled in Thrace under his treaty framework fought under his command at the Battle of the Frigidus in 394. Gothic warriors in Roman service, killing Romans on behalf of a Roman emperor in a Roman civil war. 1 generation after Adrianople, the unnamed Gothic cavalry, the foragers whose routine absence from the camp when Roman scouts counted had created the intelligence failure, whose return Ammianus described as a thunderbolt, who carried the weight of the battle's decisive moment, are not named that anywhere in our sources. Their faces, their names, their fates after the battle are entirely absent from the historical record. They won the most consequential engagement of the 4th century. History forgot them completely as individuals, while preserving what they changed. Victory immortalizes battles. It forgets the people who fight them. Adrianople is remembered. Fritigern is barely remembered. The Gothic cavalry that arrived from the countryside is not remembered at all. History selected what to preserve, and what it selected was the catastrophe, not the human beings who caused it, survived it, or died in it. Ask 100 history students to name the battle that most directly contributed to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Perhaps 5 will say Adrianople. The rest will name something else, or say nothing with confidence. The battle that killed a reigning emperor, destroyed 2/3 of the Eastern Roman field army, created the legal precedent that produced the sack of Rome, and shattered the foundational myth of Roman military invincibility, is one of the least known world historical events of the ancient world among the general public. And the reasons for its relative obscurity follow patterns that recur throughout the history of how battles are remembered or forgotten. The single source problem is the most fundamental. Ammianus Marcellinus provides the only detailed contemporary account of Adrianople. John Malalas's chronicle mentions it briefly. The Syriac church historian Zacharias Rhetor notes the conflict's existence. But no second voice provides the kind of detailed, independent corroboration that makes a battle's historical record feel stable and multidimensional. Ammianus structured his entire surviving history, 18 books covering the years 353 to 378, to culminate at Adrianople. He treated it, from the architecture of his work, as the point beyond which the Rome he had known no longer existed. That choice was deliberate and structurally significant. But it also means that everything we know about this battle in detail comes from one man, writing in Latin in Rome in the 390s, with specific biases about the emperor he was describing. Those biases compound the problem. Valens was an Arian Christian in an empire where Catholic Christianity was dominant, and Catholic historians were the primary preservers of historical memory. Scholars have noted, as the EBSCO Research Starter's assessment of the battle records, that Valens's Arianism made him deeply unpopular with Catholic historians, and that the calamitous nature of his loss may have been shaped darker in the historical record by writers who had theological reasons to portray him as divinely punished. Catholic historiography turned Adrianople into a morality tale about heresy receiving its reward. Morality tales are easier to summarize and dismiss than complex military-political catastrophes are to analyze. The transformation of Adrianople from a strategic watershed into a theological parable reduced its appeal to secular military historians. The Eastern Empire's survival complicates the most dramatic possible narrative. The standard _quote_6_ framing is factually wrong about half the Roman world. The Eastern Empire, the very empire whose field army was destroyed at Adrianople, survived as Byzantium until 1453, more than 1,000 years after the battle. An event that is sometimes presented as the beginning of Rome's end, produced no immediate end at all in the east, and only indirect and delayed consequences in the west. Audiences trained on clean, decisive narratives struggled to locate Adrianople in a story whose consequences took decades to become catastrophic and whose most direct victim eventually outlasted the battle by a millennium. The Project Muse scholarly article on the battle specifically notes that military history after the 1970s increasingly moved away from battle narrative analysis under the influence of broader historiographical trends, making Adrianople doubly neglected. Overlooked by popular history because of its complexity, and deprioritized by academic history during the decades when military narrative was professionally unfashionable. What has changed is the rediscovery. Military institutions studying operational failure, the mechanics of how armies destroy themselves before enemies do, have found Adrianople invaluable precisely because it teaches failure rather than triumph. The battle's importance for military education lies in what Ammianus documents without flinching. An empire that had been hiding structural weakness behind institutional mythology. A commander who let personal psychology override military calculation. An intelligence failure that was entirely preventable. A physical compromise that was entirely avoidable. These are the mechanisms of military catastrophe in any era. Technology changes. The human patterns that produce disaster don't. Adrianople is not studied in military academies because ancient battles are directly applicable to modern mechanized warfare. No one is preparing to defend a wagon circle against Gothic heavy cavalry. The lessons that have made this battle worth studying across 16 centuries are not tactical. They are structural. And the structures they reveal are as present in human institutions today as they were in the Roman Empire of 378. The intelligence failure is the first and most consequential. Roman scouts counted 10,000 Gothic warriors and missed an entire cavalry army because that cavalry was elsewhere when the counting happened. Ammianus records the undercount without explaining it. And that silence is itself a historical fact. No one in the Roman command structure asked how the scouts had confirmed their number, or what portion of the Gothic position they had actually surveyed, or what the margin of error in their assessment might be. The information was accepted, passed up the chain of command, and used to make a decision that determined the outcome of a battle and the trajectory of an empire. Modern military doctrine devotes entire analytical frameworks to what is called intelligence preparation of the battlefield. The systematic process of asking not just what you know about the enemy, but what you don't know, and why. The existence of this doctrine represents the institutional memory of defeats caused by failures like the one at Adrianople. The doctrine exists because the failure recurs. The jealousy lesson is more uncomfortable and more universal. Valens possessed every piece of information needed to avoid the battle on August 9th. He knew Gratian was days away. He knew his own generals counseled patience. He knew the reinforced force would be overwhelming. He attacked alone because he could not bear to share the victory with his nephew. Military institutions spend significant effort designing command structures, accountability processes, and joint operations doctrines to prevent personal ego from overriding operational logic. The effort is never completely successful. Because the human need for individual distinction that consumed Valens on August 9th is not a Roman pathology. It is a human one. The physical condition lesson documents something that military planners sometimes need to be reminded of, with brutal specificity. The Roman army that marched to Adrianople was one of the finest heavy infantry forces in the ancient world. The army that fought at Adrianople had marched 8 miles in August heat without food or water, stood in formation for hours under smoke and sun during false negotiations, and arrived at the Gothic position with its rear column still coming up. The difference between those two descriptions is not a metaphor. It is the difference between 10,000 men alive and 10,000 men dead. Modern military doctrine calls this, quote, 7, the gap between theoretical capability and actual capability at the moment of engagement. The Roman army at Adrianople had high theoretical capability and severely degraded actual capability. Valens marched them into battle without apparently registering the distinction. The structural vulnerability lesson operates at the largest scale. The Roman Empire in 376 was an institution that had been managing systemic decline for decades, with financial substitutions, manpower shortages, and strategic overextension, while maintaining the appearance of invincibility. Adrianople didn't create those vulnerabilities. It revealed them. The myth that had been doing the work of actual military capacity, the psychological intimidation that kept subject peoples in submission and rival powers cautious, was dependent on that myth remaining uncontested. When Fritigern's warriors destroyed the Eastern Field Army, they didn't just win a battle. They demonstrated that the myth was available to be tested. Every institution that mistakes the appearance of strength for actual strength is at risk of its own August 9th. The gap between what Rome believed itself to be and what Rome actually was on that morning. The gap that Valens stepped into when he left his treasury behind the walls and marched toward the hill is the space in which Adrianople happened. It is not a gap unique to Rome. It is the characteristic gap of every institution that has stopped asking hard questions about its own foundations and started relying on the weight of its own historical reputation to do the work that actual capability should be doing. 1,600 years have not closed that gap. They have simply provided more examples of what happens when armies, empires, and institutions stop asking whether the strength they believe they have is the strength they actually possess. The men were standing still. That is where we began, and it is where the accounting must end. Because everything that followed from that moment in August of 378 flows from what those men were, what they had done to reach that plain, and what the emperor standing among them chose not to understand about the situation he had created. Ammianus Marcellinus, who devoted his life's work to recording what Rome was and what it became, chose to end his history on that afternoon in Thrace. 31 books covering the history of the empire, from the accession of Nerva in 96 AD to the death of Valens. And the last image in his surviving text is the plain north of Adrianople. The bodies, the abandonment of an emperor's body to the indifferent ground. He did not write about what came after. He treated August 9th as the point beyond which the Rome he had known no longer existed, and he closed his account there. The accounting, assembled from his work and the modern scholarship that has examined it, runs as follows. Between 10,000 and 13,000 Roman soldiers dead on the plain north of modern Edirne, Turkey, based on Ammianus's 2/3 fraction, applied to the modern scholarly estimate of 15,000 to 20,000 committed troops. 35 senior commanders killed, 2 generals, the master of the offices, the quartermaster general, the emperor, somewhere in the ground, never found. On the Gothic side, Ammianus provides no casualty figures. History, in this instance, preserved the disaster and forgot its cost on the winning side. The battlefield today is agricultural land, with no monument and no marker. The city of Adrianople still stands. As Edirne, a Turkish city of roughly 200,000 people, notable for its magnificent Ottoman mosques and its position on 3 rivers near the borders of Greece and Bulgaria. The ruins of the Roman period are sparse. The __quote _8 __ survives as one of the most significant remaining Byzantine-era structures. The plain where the Eastern Roman field army died is farmed. Nothing commemorates what happened there, because no political entity has survived with both the desire and the legitimacy to commemorate it. The empire that lost the battle eventually fell. The empire that won the battle never built commemorative monuments, and the people who now live near that ground are Turkish, not Roman or Gothic, because history moved on from both of those identities in the 1,000 years that followed. What cannot be farmed away, what has persisted across 16 centuries of political change, is the sequence of decisions that Adrianople documents. A bureaucrat's greed, a chieftain's escape from a dinner table assassination, a careful emperor's one act of recklessness, an intelligence failure that history has never fully explained, a cavalry that arrived from routine foraging at the worst possible moment for the army it found, a body that was never identified, never buried, never found. Adrianople didn't kill the Roman Empire. It revealed that the Roman Empire had already been dying, carefully, administratively, successfully hiding the evidence for decades. What Valens walked into on August 9th wasn't a trap Fritigern had designed. It was a truth Rome had been postponing. The men standing still in the smoke that morning didn't know they were standing at the edge of the ancient world. They were just thirsty. History is usually made by people who don't know they're making it. Adrianople, in that respect, was no different from the rest of history, except that on that particular afternoon, the consequences of not knowing were measured in the collapse of a civilization that had taken 8 centuries to build.